Good morning, guys. Today we are going to start a new unit. I hope that you liked our Shakespeare unit. I hope you gained some understanding of Shakespeare and perhaps some appreciation. I hope you're all set for next year when you're going to tackle Macbeth. And bottom line, hopefully you all understand the why part of why we studied Shakespeare. We're going to start our new unit today. I'm going to talk to you about poetry. Our poetry unit is not going to be tough, guys, so if you have any preconceived ideas, please forget those. Usually students are terrified of poetry. At this point in the year, hopefully you trust me and you know that I will do right by you and I'll walk you through it just like we did Shakespeare. In order for us to understand and communicate effectively, we do have to talk about some poetry terms. So our first one, guys, is poetic license. And I bring that up because I'm wearing a tie with a t-shirt. So why? Because that's not the norm. Poetic license is focusing on writing in order to create an effect, and in the process you are allowed to ignore or not follow correctly the conventions of grammar. So sometimes when we write poetry, words will be left out, words will be shortened, the grammatical sentence structure will not be correct. We might not even have complete sentences. That will be especially important in poems when we have to have a certain number of syllables per line. So poetic license means, unlike formal writing, we are allowed to bend the rules a little bit, especially as far as grammar and sentence structure. And that's called poetic license. Because we're writing poetry, we have a license to do something that's not the norm. Much like me wearing a bow tie with a t-shirt, even though it still looks stylish. Next word we want to talk about is hyperbole. It's spelled like hyperbole, but it's pronounced hyperbole. Hyperbole is an exaggeration for emphasis. Nobody's going to take it literally. We know that it is an exaggeration. We're doing it on purpose. So what does that look like? Probably your parents or grandparents had a million hyperbolic expressions like hungry as a horse, as big as a house, etc. A good example from a song a few years ago is Adele was telling somebody that they were upset. She was upset because they didn't return her calls, and she said, "I must have called 1,000 times." Could she have called 1,000 times? Sure, especially if she's psychotic, but chances are she didn't really call 1,000 times. It was just a number of times. In 2020, you could tell a friend, "I was texting you all day. Why didn't you respond?" Well, you might have sent 3 or 4 texts. You literally were not texting all day. It's hyperbole. You're exaggerating to make a point. Next, because poetry is all about expressing abstract concepts in a more concrete way, we have a lot of comparisons in poetry, a lot of poetic language. So 2 types of comparisons that we're going to deal with, first of all, are metaphor and simile. They're both similar, they're both comparisons. It's all in the phrasing. A metaphor, we do not use the terms like or as. In a simile, we do use the words like or as. Simile is the most common in our language. Metaphor might sound strange to you, but if you look at the phrasing and the word choice, did I use like or as, or did I not? And even if it sounds strange, guys, remember poetic license. Metaphors are correct, we just don't use them verbally a lot. So what do those look like? So a simile would be like Katy Perry, she had a song a few years back, "Did you ever feel like a plastic bag?" Or "Do you ever feel like a plastic bag?" Well, quite frankly, Katie, no, I've never felt like a plastic bag. Now, it's a simile because it has the word like in there. Did you feel like a plastic bag? It's poetic because it's comparing a feeling to a plastic bag. It might initially not make sense until you hear the rest of the song lyrics, and then you can understand, oh, so that's what she's talking about. So, simile using like or as. I remember it because simile has an L in it, and like starts with an L, of course. We also have metaphor, and a metaphor doesn't use like or as. So, what does that look like? Sia has a song a few years ago, and she said, I am titanium. Titanium is a metal. It's very tough. It's very durable. She's saying she's strong. She's so strong, she's that metal. Now, you can probably see the difference, and the reason why we have those two is because there's something subtly different about saying, I'm like this, or I am this. I'm like metal, I'm so strong. Or, I'm not just like it, I am it. So, in simpler terms, simile is here, metaphor is next level. You're not just like that thing, you are that thing. So, again, simile, metaphor, using like or as, or not using like or as. Next, we have personification. We've dealt with personification pretty much all year. Personification is when we give human characteristics to something that's not human. And again, because we're trying to explain abstract things in a more concrete way, what better way for us to understand than if we give non-living things human characteristics? There's a poem that talks about walking into an empty room and the walls laughing at you. Well, walls don't laugh. They don't have mouths, they don't have vocal cords, but they're trying to explain that feeling that perhaps everybody's mocking you. Even the walls themselves are mocking you. Inanimate objects are even making fun of you. That would be personification. Next, we have oxymoron. Refrain from calling each other an oxymoron, please. An oxymoron is an obvious and intentional, purposeful contradiction in a phrase. Something that's contradictory is opposite, but also true. So, like a paradox almost. A good example of oxymoron, this morning I told somebody that, because they said we just need to use common sense, and I responded, it's 2020, common sense isn't really common in 2020, is it? That would be an oxymoron, common sense. Common means it's regularly occurring. Sense means that intelligence to do the right thing. So, especially in 2020, perhaps not so much. Simpler examples, perhaps on the menu at your seafood restaurant, it advertises jumbo shrimp. Shrimps are small. Yes, I said shrimps. And jumbo is something large, so you're saying a large, small thing. Not the greatest example, but again, it's an oxymoron because it's a contradiction. We have probably the most fun word to say, not so fun to spell, is the word onomatopoeia. An onomatopoeia is a sound word. What that means, guys, is a word that's trying to mimic, your pronunciation of that word is trying to mimic the sound that it makes. Think of like animal noises. What does a cat say? Meow. Let's go back to kindergarten. What does a cow say? Moo. Moo, meow. Those are onomatopoeias. They don't have to be a sound an animal makes, though. A gun going off is a bang. A car slamming on the brakes, the tires might screech or squeal. Those are sound words. Crash, boom, etc. Again, pronouncing the word itself is supposed to mimic the actual sound. What's kind of interesting is if you study foreign language, apparently animals in different countries say different things. It's kind of interesting sometimes to look those up and, for instance, say, what sound does a cat make in Chinese? it's not meow. So apparently, Chinese cats have an accent. Okay? Onomatopoeia. Next, we're going to talk about rhyme. We have two different types of poetry we are going to be writing, and one of them we have to use rhyme. What's a little scary is everybody thinks they have mad rhyming skills. Not everybody does have mad rhyming skills. So we're going to talk about a number of things to do and do not do as we go through this. In simplest terms, a rhyme is the repetition of like sounds. So it's a sounds like. What sounds like rat, bat, that type of thing. Think back to kindergarten. Repeating the same word twice is not a rhyme. It is repeating the same word. You want a different word that sounds like it because usually the vowel sound. Now, what's tough about poetry is the way we're exposed to poetry in 2020 is through song lyrics. And yes, we have poetic license, but a lot of song lyrics kind of mess with the elements of like rhyme scheme and rhythm, etc. So we're going to talk about that. We want to be careful. We can't say, well, Nicki Minaj does this in this song. Well, God bless Nicki Minaj, because without her, I wouldn't have examples of what not to do. You can't just repeat the same word and make it a rhyme. Likewise, a slant rhyme means it kind of rhymes, but it doesn't really. So what does that look like? If I were to write two words on the board, you might look at them and say, no, they don't rhyme. And then we might listen to a Nicki Minaj song and we hear the way she skews the pronunciation. She makes it sound like it does rhyme. So that's called a slant rhyme. It almost rhymes, but not quite. It's not a perfect rhyme. You kind of bend the pronunciation or whatever to make it sound like it is rhyming. Next, let's talk about one other thing that we need in rhyming poetry, and that is rhythm. There's a reason why song lyrics fit the beat of the music. Rhythm is the beat that song has. In simplest terms, what makes it rhyme are similar numbers of syllables. So we want to look at those syllables. What are syllables? Syllables are the division of the word, the unit of pronunciation, the beat, if you will. For those of you that are musicians, you would look at music and the notes tell you the beat. The syllables in poetry tell you the beat. Why is that important? Because again, we want to be able to count syllables, and that's what's going to give our rhyming poetry some rhythm. Also, there are some other types of poetry that do not rhyme that require you to count syllables. So, for instance, haiku. A haiku has 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. By definition, if your first line has 6 instead of 5, it's not a haiku. So we have to be able to count syllables. How do we count syllables? If you go back to other teachers, I'm sure they've told you all sorts of numbers of different ways to count syllables. One is the clappy method. That one drives me crazy because, first of all, it implies if you're going to clap on the beat of the word that you're pronouncing it correctly and you already know where the syllable is. So let's look at a couple words, like every. Did you see what I did there? I pronounce it every. Every. Huh. What about people who say every? Every. What about veteran? Veteran. A lot of people say veteran. Okay? So, again, what's the correct answer? And one of my favorites, I say literally. I go kind of British. Literally. And others pronounce it literally. So how do we know, because it's important, how many syllables a word has? We need to look it up. Yes, I know that takes a few seconds, oh heaven forbid, but we want to get it right. We want to make sure it's correct. So where do we look it up? There are some websites that tell you syllables. What's a little sketchy, guys, is they might contradict each other. One site might say 2 syllables, the other might say 3. So which to go with? What I'd recommend is you actually use a dictionary site. You don't need to look up every word. You look up the words you're uncertain of. You can't for the life of you figure out, is it just 1 syllable or is it 2? Because it starts to play with your mind and you start to change the pronunciation. So when you look up a word in a dictionary, on a dictionary site, it will have the word divided into the number of syllables. Sometimes there'll be a little line between, sometimes a little dot, and that will tell you the definitive source for how many syllables will be that site. So make sure to use that, and again, only if you're uncertain. You don't need to look up how many syllables are in the word dog. That's 1. Could you stretch it out and make it 2? Maybe if you have some strange, like, hillbilly accent or something, perhaps. But dog is 1 syllable for sure. You can count on that. We also need to talk about stanza. A stanza is the division of lines in the poem. Think of like the verse of a song. How many verses does a song have? When we look at a poem, we don't call those verses, we call those stanzas. And that's important because if we're referencing a poem and we say, in the second stanza of this poem, we need to know what they're talking about. Likewise, when you're assigned poetry and you're told you have to write 3 stanzas, you need to be able to know, what am I talking about? What does a stanza mean? Again, think of like verses or the division of lines in the poem. The other type of poem we're going to write, rather than rhyming poetry, is we're going to work on free verse. Now, listen carefully. Some people come into my class every year thinking free verse means I have the freedom to go rogue and do whatever I want. We haven't had an assignment all year where we just go rogue and do whatever. We always have criteria. So for our purposes, guys, remember, free verse does not mean just go rogue and do whatever. Free verse means you have a little more freedom than the rhyming poetry. Why? Because for the most part, free verse definitely doesn't have rhyming, and often it doesn't have a rhythm to it either. But it certainly doesn't have rhyme. Don't be that kid who says, oh, but Street Money, it accidentally rhymed. Well, I'll respond, accidentally unrhyme it then. Because with our free verse, we don't want the rhyme. Trust me, guys, rhyming is tougher. Even if you're sitting there thinking, oh, I've got this, I'm the best rapper on the planet, we shall see, okay? So, don't make it tougher than it is. So, simplest terms, rhyming poetry, we have a rhyme scheme, we have lines that rhyme, and we have a rhythm, which is the pattern of emphasis, or like a cadence, remember that word from vocabulary? That sequence of sounds. And free verse, which means we don't have to be bound by rhyme for sure, and oftentimes we don't have to worry about the rhythm either. Sometimes in free verse, most times in free verse, especially the free verse we're studying, there are other criteria that we have to meet, okay? So that covers most of the poetry terms that we're going to be dealing with. This week we will start on our first poem. Please don't be nervous. Most years kids knock it out of the park. They do exceedingly well with poetry. Kids who maybe have been getting C's all year, all of a sudden are getting A's, and I get emails from parents asking, no offense, Street Money, but did you make a mistake? Johnny's a C student and now he's getting straight A's. And I can write back saying, because he's following the criteria and he's doing well. Hopefully you trust me well enough to know I will lead you through this, I will help you with it. Just don't walk into it thinking it's going to be super tough, I can't do this. The only limits we have are those we put on ourselves. So if you say I can't, then we'll have self-fulfilling prophecy, which means it will come true because you make it come true. So think, I trust Street Money, I'm going to follow the criteria, I'm going to own this unit, I'm going to finish the year strong, and I'm going to be a poetic genius. I'll show that Nicki Minaj. Okay? So, in the meantime, guys, make sure to enjoy this coronation. I'm going crazy. I need social. Also, remember, you were blessed to be a blessing. Adios.